Hi, everybody. Welcome to Why Do I Need a Vulnerability Management Process for Open Source? My name is Beth, and I am a Senior Product Manager at Armory. I am a lover of puns, movie quotes, and making the lives of DevOps and security folks better. Why are we here? We are here to talk about vulnerability management process. Now, some of you may have had to interface in this process, and it wasn't particularly your favorite, and that's okay. So let's talk about how to educate you in terms of what it means, what your role can be, and why you want something like this for your enterprise as well as your open source, specifically your open source projects. So we're going to start off by talking about what CVEs are, why a CVSS score is important, what is a vulnerability, how do you patch it, why do you patch it, what is the Spinnaker open source vulnerability management process, why you want a CISO. CISOs are amazing, that's why. And then how can you help participate in this process? It's going to be fun, I promise. And I only have like one Deadpool reference, so like we're winning here. So anyone who's perhaps had to work in a CVE in a situation, maybe Heartbleed or any of the things that have come up since then, which I cannot remember, but I can always remember Heartbleed. Best name, I guess, is it feels a little bit like a tire fire, which is not your favorite. Most people are not a fan of a tire fire, dumpster fire, or any other kind of fire unless it's a healthily contained campfire, or maybe in your house. So let's talk a little bit about what CVEs are and how this, understanding more about CVEs and that process and creating a vulnerability management process is going to make your life that much easier. I promise. Maybe I can't. So first of all, a CVE might make you feel a little bit like sad Keanu. And, you know, I get it. It's a little unknown. We don't know what's going on. He's hanging out there on his little park bench, eating a sandwich, maybe having a bad day. So a CVE, and again, this, just to make sure that I'm clear, the CVE and CVSS, threat modeling stuff, that is all other people's knowledge that I am sharing with you. This is not mine. There are links to the appropriate documentation. So a CVE is a cybersecurity vulnerability and exposure that is free to search, use, and incorporate into products and services. What? Yes. What that means is someone has already identified that there's a vulnerability out there and they've created a nice little ID for you so that you can go and clearly identify when that CVE is present within your technology. And how would you do that? That is where your security scans come in handy. Why you get a security scan that is going to identify for you what those CVEs are. Now let's move on to the cute and fuzzy kitten. Everybody loves the cute and fuzzy kitten, unless you're allergic, in which case still looking at cute and fuzzy kittens are fantastic. So that brings us to the common vulnerabilities scoring system. What that means is we're going to create a score for the CVE. Why? Well, one of the reasons why is just because the CVE is noted as being a high severity critical CVE doesn't mean that the way that that code lives in your code base, that it's actually a high vulnerability. In fact, you can have some instances where you have a high vulnerability CVE. Let's say I'm going to pick a number out of the air, it's an 8. But then after you kind of run through your own scoring system, it turns out that it's like a 1.9. And you're like, what? That's magic. Can we do that with all of them? No, you really can't. But let's talk about how we come about with a CVSS score. Whoa, that looks like an awful lot of stuff. So here is a calculator, one calculator. There are many that are out there. And this calculator is going to take, what it does is it takes different attack vectors, it takes different areas of your technology, and it helps you to come up with a score for how likely is it that this is something that is exploitable within your specific project. So if you take an open source project, you're going to take a look at, and Spinnaker, for example, you're going to take a look at how it, if the CVE lives in Igor, Roscoe, Front 50, Fiat, Orca Gate, wherever it lives, and you're going to take a look at all the different ways that somebody can actually enter into that code base. And from there, you're going to come up with a score. My cat's going to join us. There's no call that is complete without a cat. From there, what we do is we are going to create threat models, because what we want to do is we want to make sure that our CVSS score is as defensible as possible. Defensible, that means that we have to protect that our scoring is the way it is, and not just, hey, we didn't like that it was an 8, we want it to be a 1.9. No, you need to demonstrate that the reason why you scored it as a 1.9 is based on data. So a threat model is really one way that you can do that. So if you take all the microservices for Spinnaker, for example, what you need to identify is all the entry points that somebody can leverage to get in there, how all of those microservices work together, and then all the entry points in those connections. And then you just keep taking it a layer up and a layer up and a layer up. And what that tells you for the threat model is how embedded the code is, how protected the code is. So you might have something that is a CVE that lives in, let's say it lives in Spinnaker, it lives in Tecton, and it lives in Argo. Those scores could be dramatically different in between each of those projects. And that's just based on the structure of the microservices, those connections, and the code base. Make sense? So what do we do next? We've identified that something is vulnerable, and so now we need to patch it. And what does that mean, to patch it? Well, sometimes what that means is you need to do a version bump. So let's say you need to do a Spring Boot security version bump, and maybe that takes care of like 20 of your CVEs. What? One action for 20 CVE? Yes, that is in fact how open source projects and other enterprise projects would work, because you're pulling in other technology to your open source project. So you need to understand what the risks are that you're pulling in, as well as any of the risks within the code that you manage. So it's kind of like a cool ecosystem. Why open source ought to have a security posture. This is the exciting part, isn't it? So go out there, grab your girl gang, and we are going to talk about why having a security posture for your open source project helps with adoption. Yes, it does. Let's talk about why it helps with adoption. So one of the reasons is, let's talk about the logic of why you would want to fix a vulnerability in open source to begin with. So if you are an open source community, and like Spinnaker, and you have financial institutions, or you have retail, insurance, hospitals, or government that use your product, or your project rather, they are going to ensure that that is secure, which means they have to do a security scan themselves. Yes, that's right. They do security scans on all their third-party tools, open source, enterprise, it doesn't matter. And in some cases, maybe it's a little scarier for those security folks if it is in fact an open source project, because they don't know if you are actually managing and maintaining those vulnerabilities, AKA a great reason for having a vulnerability management process for your open source. So the best way to help with adoption is with that vulnerability management process. If you are doing that, you have all these industries that have the ability to now start participating, because it is a more secure project. That's right. And with that, that means that they are more inclined to allow their employees to contribute their time and donate their employees' time to the project and the different projects that or features that are being built. That's amazing. So then you have this great outlook of people that are coming to your community, that are using your product, that are going to battle test it. And not only that, they're going to expand what that project might need to look like because they're coming from different industries. And so you've created a richer, fuller project. Oh, that wasn't a pun. So grow your project via vulnerability management. There's a plan. So if you have a vulnerability management process, that is often a measure of a project's maturity. What? Yes. Because what it does is it demonstrates that there's a direction and a purpose that you're focused on with that project. It means that you've put in this time and effort, and you have community members that have donated their time, their knowledge, so that they can make a more secure project. It also allows you to do planning. So you can do regular scans within your project, and that might mean that in the future, so for example, in the future for Spinnaker, we want to get to the point where we can do scans before we merge code. And you're probably thinking, oh my gosh, that sounds terrible. Isn't it going to slow things down? Yes and no. It might slow things down in that if you're going to merge code and you do find a fairly high or critical vulnerability, that you're going to have to do some work in terms of patching that or mitigating what the risk is with that CVE. Now, is that such a bad thing? Or would you rather roll that out, have someone file an issue, and then you have an emergency where you have to then fix it? So this is really just making things so that you have fewer tire fires. Now, granted, new CVEs happen on a daily basis. They're identified on a daily basis. And that's just a thing that you will have tire fires, but perhaps not as many. The last one, winning the hearts and minds of the security team. So security people, I absolutely adore security people. And security teams are going to push to ensure that a project is safe enough to stick around for the long haul. Why? Why? Well, think about it. If you're a security person, one of your jobs is to make sure that you keep your company out of the news. If you have teams that are pulling in a whole bunch of open source projects, that means you have to review all this open source code to ensure that that is safe. That means that you've put processes in place that they cannot adopt those projects upstream into these organizations until scans have happened. And then they're going to have to do regular scans, and it's going to slow down the process for upping the intake of new releases, because there's this concern about including more CVEs, or if there are any that are found, it becomes an emergency. And that means that the team who wants to leverage that open source project might need to address that CVE on their own, making it less likely that they're going to want to participate if they are the only person, as opposed to having a team. It's like this. When you think about that scene in Deadpool 2, it's the one where they're in the prison and Deadpool and Cable are fighting. And it gets to the point where Ryan Reynolds' Deadpool says to Josh Brolin's Cable, says, "You're so dark. Are you sure you're not from the DC universe?" And that's pretty much how I view the importance of having a vulnerability management process. Is you want people to be less Cable and rigid, and you want to move them over to more of a Ryan Reynolds aspect or persona. Yeah, I know. It's just a thing. It's going to happen. All right, so the Spinnaker open source policy document. We're gonna go through that step by step because it's awesome, it's a lot, and I'm not the one who came up with it. We had a CISO that helped us, so you know that it's right, and it's using industry best practices, which is awesome. All right, so for our first step, we have a front door. As with anything, if you enter a place, you have your front door, which is your primary entrance for things that you can decide what comes in and what doesn't, or who, or in this case, which vulnerabilities. So the idea here is that you have security at spinnaker.io, and everyone has the opportunity or has the ability to send any vulnerabilities that they find. And for right now, if they find a CVE, then they, as an CVE with an ID, as well as maybe a new vulnerability, they send it to security@spinnaker.io. Actually, that's not going to change, but that's where you would send it. Then we have a set of time within that security SIG to review those requests, to go through an entire process to identify the risk associated with that. Additionally, we have a security policy that is posted on the Spinnaker GitHub repositories. Yes, that's right. So you don't have to remember security@spinnaker.io based on this conference talk. Instead, you can go to the repository and you can see what that security policy is. And it's just there, the information is available to you, which is amazing, because who wants to figure out like, oh, I saw it in Slack, there might be a document over here, I don't know where it is. No, it's just right there. And I skipped. So the next thing is, what does that security SIG team do with those vulnerabilities? Essentially what happens is we go through and we're going to identify, is this a known issue or not? We're going to assess if the vulnerability, if they're like, does this vulnerability apply in the context of a deployed Spinnaker instance? I'm just going to read it because it's far cleaner than if I would wing it off the top of my head. So essentially what we want to know is, where does the CVE, how it's tucked into our code, how does it impact someone? Can someone who's a bad actor actually get to it and cause damage? Are the exploits or proof of concept code, are there exploits or proof of concept code to take advantage of the vulnerability? What? Yes. Essentially what you want to find out here is, in the case of Heartbleed, one of the reasons why that became, and hopefully I'm getting this right, but one of the reasons why that became such a big deal is because not only was the vulnerability announced, but how to exploit it was announced as well. And that's when it becomes a fairly critical thing for you to jump on and address. So that is taken into consideration as we're going through and reviewing the different vulnerabilities. And then next you need to assess which versions are impacted by this. Like, how far back do we need to go? How big of an issue is it? How broad is this, how broad is the impact? So once you've done that, we have a taxonomy in terms of, for the Spinnaker open source project, which is here. And this basically talks about how we rank and rate the high, medium, and low. And then there's going to be a corresponding time frame in which we will mitigate those vulnerabilities, which is very important. Next, we're going to go through and track this, and we're going to track it in an issues-only private repository. You're probably thinking, really? But yes, you want it in an issues-only private repository. And the reason for that is because you don't want everyone to have access to a vulnerability that is a known vulnerability within your open source project, because that means a bad actor can come in and exploit it. So if you're doing something like a continuous delivery project like Spinnaker open source, what that does is that opens you up to people being able to break in to that process and getting access to PII data, perhaps deploying code that they shouldn't be able to deploy because you don't want that, or who knows what else they have the ability to then daisy chain to get into within your system. So it's best to keep it in an issue-only private repository. But not to worry, it does become public after all the issues and communications have happened. So we go through, and if it doesn't have an ID, then we will get an ID. We'll do the CVSS score, as we kind of talked about before. We're going to have an understanding and an explanation of the vulnerability and all the different components that it addresses. So that's where we get to figure out, is this something like Spring Boot security, and all we need to do is bump the version on it, and that's going to solve those 20 odd issues. If that's all it is, that's great. And so then those are the things that we need to, as we're going through this step 3 and tracking the vulnerability, that's the kind of information that you want to find out. So then it's not that you're just sending it out to people and saying, hey, vulnerability, good luck. Instead, you're really streamlining that process. Is it within the microservice, or is it something that spans across all microservices? Because there's more efficient and effective ways to address that. And then we would write something up about it, and we would talk about the timeline for mitigating the vulnerability. Pretty logical. After that, we would mitigate it, and the end result being, if you look at a lot of organizations, Atlassian being one that I think most people have, a product most people have used, there's usually a security page, and it's going to talk about the vulnerabilities that have been addressed and what version it impacted, where it was, when it was fixed, and what the fix was, or some bit of information. That is the goal in the future, that we will have that as part of the open source vulnerability process. So you're probably thinking about this and you're like, yeah, but still, why would I want to have that for open source? Well, also, let's take into consideration all the people that are using open source upstream. Now you've created a scenario where people might have to actually branch or fork your code so that they can address the CVEs, as opposed to you just addressing it at the root. So then you become like this, a far more powerful entity or project, because you're already addressing all of this. You have a standard, industry standard way of handling it. You've turned people less cable and more Deadpool. Now let's talk about the power of a CISO. The great thing is we actually have a CISO that helped us with our security SIG and coming up with all of this process. Trust me, this is not something that I did on my own. This was definitely a group effort. So we had other security professionals that participated from other organizations. So it also wasn't just an Armory event. It was definitely an open source security event where we had security folks from multiple organizations. I know that was a little redundant, but I just want to make sure it's clear that this is best practice according to a number of people, a collective. So one of the great things about having a CISO is it's going to affirm the security posture of the open source community. CISOs, security people, they all talk to each other, which is good and bad. They have their own language. They talk to each other in a very particular way. And I know as a product manager, I'm not going to step in that lane because I don't live in that world, and I'm not even going to pretend. So as I've used specific terminology, it's very basic. And the reason for that is I'm not going to throw out a bunch of security terms because I want to use word vomit. If I wanted to do that, you know, I'd like double click on the synergy and pivot. I'm not going to do that. And so it's best to have someone who actually understands that language and understands the risks and understands the challenges of security folks and security teams. So if you can, as you're building out a vulnerability management process for your open source project, grab some CISOs, grab some security professionals, and have them help you to build out that pattern and best practice, or mimic other projects that are doing things really well. I know the Kubernetes community does a great job. So just follow some of those other best practices. The other thing it does help with is, because there is that connection with CISOs, and because a lot of folks, that industry, they all talk to each other, having that name and that person is part of their brand. And when it's part of their brand, and everyone talks to each other, you have the opportunity within your open source project to bring in a level of comfort for some people that are stepping in. So they're like, oh, I feel a little nervous about it, but hey, I trust this person and I know what their skill set is, and I understand that they followed best practice, that that best practice is going to be followed. Collaboration. How can we all help? So what do we need from you in order to make this vulnerability process successful? One is, remember, security at spinnaker.io. If you are working in the, if you're working in the project and you come across something and it seems a little bit hinky, you've noticed that this might be a problem, send an email. That's what we're here for. You can also participate in the CVE process. So if you want to be a participant, let's say you're a budding security person and you want to dive into this, then this is a great way to gain some skill set in this area, because you're going to, again, have a CISO that's going to, and other security professionals that are going to help guide what this process is and how to be successful with it. Join the Security SIG. We talk about all kinds of security related things. Right now, we've really been going through the vulnerability process and how we're going to implement that. But sometimes we talk about really fun things like, I don't know, weird ways that people have used duct tape and to do construction work in our homes previously. I mean, you can't beat some of those stories. There's some weird ones. People do funky stuff when they're working on homes. Ask questions in the Security SIG channel. It's a great place. If you don't know, ask a question. If you don't feel comfortable having it in Slack, again, security at spinnaker.io. The other thing you can do is help us create threat models. That's a very complex thing for a project that is as complex as Spinnaker. And one of the great things about creating that threat model is you can, as you go through and you find those breach points, one of the things that we might find out are ways to streamline some of our codes, some of our features that we have in there, and it might shake out some enhancements. And that's amazing. So hopefully you learned a little bit about the reason why you would want a vulnerability management process with your in the open source project that you're working on. I might suggest that you go to a couple of other talks if you want to learn a little bit more about security. I know that Jacques and Jacob and Tim are doing a policy related conversation, and they're also going to talk about some of the challenges with fiat, because, you know, Travis doesn't want to fix it again. There's also Lee Faust and Andrew Way that are going to be doing a talk on policy-driven deployment, and there are plenty of others. So please join some of those other talks and learn a little bit more about how the community is thinking about securing the product. And I'm going to stop this recording so that you can ask any questions that you might have of me.